Hello, everybody. Excuse me. As I said before, my name is Declan Jacobson. I'm here today to kick off this panel discussion about rural voices and I-93 and how its construction affected the communities around it and how it changed the stories around it as well. We're very glad that you guys are here today. Thank you so much for coming. As you see on your seats, we have a brochure. Within that brochure is a couple QR codes. One is a link that'll lead you to a place for you to share your own stories and your own experiences with rural places and rural narratives. The second is a document that just contains a lot of background information and good general briefs about the history of I-93, its construction, and the general area, especially concerning the notch. So really quick, I'm going to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. Rebecca Weeks-Sherrill-Moore, visiting scholar, Department of History at Brown University, and Director Emerita. Our next is Mr. Brian Fowler. He's a consulting engineering and structural geologist. He's the current president of the Old Man and the Mountain Legacy Fund, and is the past president and life trustee of the Mount Washington Observatory. And then we have Miss Jane Diffie, a licensed forester who served as the first female president of the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests until her retirement in 2019. Welcome and thank you guys for so much for being here. And I'm going to kick it over now to Zena, and she's going to get this panel discussion started.
I'm also a recovering English major as an undergrad, just so you know.
Right, and Jane's from the seacoast.
No, I'm not.
Well, I thought you were from Stroud.
No, my grandmother was
Your
born in Stroud.
grandmother, see, you had a seacoast connection.
I did.
Right.
I live in Webster, New Hampshire.
Okay, just to give you guys a little bit of an idea of the structure of this event, we ourselves crafted some questions for our three lovely guests. And then after we go through some of those, we would really love to open it up to the crowd. So while they're talking and giving their answers and giving us a little bit about their life story and their connection to rural spaces, start thinking about some questions that you might have for them regarding maybe their answers or just something you're curious about, and maybe they happen to be an expert in that field. So we want to start with Jane with this first question, but all of these questions are for the three of you, by the way, so feel free to click on your answers while the other person's talking. But our first question is, what is your connection to rural spaces in New Hampshire?
Oh. How long do you have? So I live in a small town, and as a forester, I like to be near the woods, and I am where I live. But for 23 years, I was the head of the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests. And that's an organization, a statewide organization that was founded to protect the White Mountains before there was a White Mountain National Forest. And that organization owns a lot of land, but also has conservation easements on a lot of land. So I spent a lot of time visiting forests and visiting landowners and lots of rural parts of the state. I live in a very small town. There are 1,800 people in Webster, and I can walk out my back door and be in acres and acres and acres of forest. And I do that every morning with my dog. I grew up in a small town in central Massachusetts, and I've always liked the rural lifestyle. One of the ways I sometimes describe a rural lifestyle is that we're more concerned about how our woodpile looks than we are about what our lawn looks like. And that's kind of part of my definition of living in a rural place. And while I have ancestors that are from New Hampshire, I was born in Massachusetts. It wasn't my fault. And but when I had the opportunity to come back to New Hampshire, I embraced that, and specifically because it's a rural state and offers so many opportunities to hike and to be outdoors. And the Forest Society is, because of its history since 1901, is largely responsible for the fact that the landscapes of New Hampshire are what they are today.
Sweet. Do you want to go next?
Oh, same question?
Yeah, same question.
Rural spaces in New Hampshire, my family came here in the 17th century as farmers. Like many people, including probably some of your families and people you know. So they were immigrants. They came hoping for opportunities, And, I'm sure if you think back to the seacoast area, in those days, it was mostly marsh. And fish was the focus, shipping fish back to Europe. So, the farmers were not there to create big farms. They were there to provide a way to send fish back to the European markets. Most people who came were very average people. They were as well. They were farmers from where they came, and they came to be farmers. And they remained that way until after the Revolution, when there was a fair amount of crowding in the seacoast area. And so families like mine, somebody in the family said, well, I'm going to take a couple of cows and I'm going to make my way from the seacoast up to the other side of the White Mountains. And they did. Initially, those settlements had hardly anybody. And when the revolution occurred, they were down to, sometimes 5 or 6 people. But after the revolution, people began to move up and were farmers. And so in that area, my family, we still have a farm up there. And even though I've worked in Rhode Island for many 50 odd years, it's still home up there, and I've got family up there. So that's the first thing, is with regard to New Hampshire and rural spaces, is association with a farm. And my grandfather had a working farm, and all of us grandchildren, there were 24 of us, were expected to pitch in when we came to visit. It wasn't just, hanging around. You were expected to work and pitch in. And another side of the family came up to do lumber and starch mills. So understanding a little bit more about how in the early 19th century, farming kind of started transforming rural areas like New Hampshire with things like starch mills, which I'm sure you're all thinking, starch mills? What you want to think of is potatoes and textiles. And that's a bigger topic. We won't get into that today. I'll just leave you with that. And again, once that began to happen, then stagecoach companies like the Plymouth Stagecoach were beginning to take people up over the mountains. And so some members of the family got involved in the stagecoach business. So you could be a farmer, have a starch mill, get involved with stagecoaches, and maybe even run a little inn. So that was one area, and I have several others, but I will get to those.
Okay. Brian, we would love to hear from you too of your connection to rural spaces.
Yeah, I think if everybody can still hear me, I was brought up in a family that has been in rural spaces for hundreds of years. When I was a kid, I had a couple of geologists in my family who inoculated me with the current disease I still have, and they were responsible for a lot of the original geologic mapping of northern New England and New Hampshire in particular. And when I was 8 years old, I got out on field trips with them and really developed quite a love for the outdoors, and have wound up in many ways getting to know the surface of New Hampshire and the bedrock geology of New Hampshire better than I ever should have, probably. But I got during my life, I've been out on all these field trips, like I say, and then when I was in college, I worked for the Appalachian Mountain Club for 7 years, 7 summers. This is in the days before the helicopters, when we carried everything up and down the mountains. And so being a geologist, I was looking at rocks while I was packing, and that gave me a nice broad exposure to New Hampshire's geology that has held me in pretty good stead. I have continued up here. When I got out of college and out of the Army, I went to work for the New Hampshire Highway Department and got involved, as you'll hear as we go along here, in the environmental impact statements for I-93 for the Parkway. And I'm, as you said in the introduction, I'm now involved with the Old Man of the Mountain Legacy Fund, which has a task which morphs a little bit from time to time, but our our purpose is to see if we can take the legacy of the old man of the mountain and the environment that he nested in Franconia Notch, and keep that legacy alive going forward. It's a task that Jane knows well. She's on our board, and it's been a huge help. As she said, she was involved with the Forest Society for years and years, and without the Forest Society, Franconia Notch would not be what you see it today, for sure. Anyway, I got involved with different things in the White Mountains, the Mount Washington Observatory, and a lot of the research that's gone on there. And that's a whole nother story for another seminar probably. But anyway, so that's the basis of it. And as you can tell, because I'm not in the room there this morning, I'm still involved with New Hampshire geology, and keeps me busy. Probably never retire, as they say.
That's great. Question 2, Rebecca, we'd like you to start off with this one, but it says, tell us about your connection to Franconia Notch before, during, or after the building of I-93.
Okay, so I thank you. I had the questions ahead, so I did a little thinking about it. So you can imagine with a grandfather and family up north of the mountains, my family lived down in the Boston area. So the travel up, starting in the 1940s, was on Route 3. Marianne will remember. It was one little motel after another, very exciting, which kept small children from going crazy. But it took about 5 hours to get up from Boston, which was a lot better than when my mother was a girl. I think it took about 8 hours, and my grandfather smoked cigars and kept the windows up. And the 6 children in the family spent most of the time asking to stop so they could get out and get sick. So it was a long trip. So I-90, what became I-93 was just Route 3, and it wended its way. And if you've seen the wonderful pictures by people like Thomas Cole of the stagecoach coming, that it really actually stayed a lot like that right up until I-93 was actually put together. So, you know, it was a scenic trip. You looked forward to the Indian Head and all the various things that you could see, the flume along the way, which was, you know, and no air conditioning either. So a 5-hour trip in the car took quite a long time. But there was, for me, one curious factor, which I'll just mention briefly and we can come back to, which was that the same grandfather that owned the farm happened to be the Secretary of Commerce in Eisenhower's administration. And as some of you may know from your studies, in 1956, Eisenhower, based on his own personal experiences during World War I, of how hard it was just to get back and forth across the US, and having masterminded, along with other people, the war in Europe in World War II, was determined that we would have better transport systems, and it wouldn't just be rail, which was fine, except that it could take a really long time and was hard to move a lot of material. So he had this vision. 56, they signed that into law. When Eisenhower signed the document into law, he credited Sinclair Weeks, my grandfather, with having been the person who put the most, he said it was a tribute to Weeks's hard work in finding funding, which was, of course, the gas tax. And he didn't do it alone. There was a whole group of people who were part of that. But the reason I mention it is because, so I knew from the time, from 1956, they already knew where the interstates were going. And so, of course, one of them was, oh, one of these days it'll only take you a few hours to get from Boston, not sweltering in a hot, unair-conditioned car. My father at the time was a minister out in Ohio. And I remember my mother pointing out the back window of our house and saying, your grandfather says someday, and we were on a cliff, there will be an interstate highway there. Well, it isn't very often in life that somebody says to you, in the future, this will happen, but it did. So my experience with the interstates, and I'm sure some of us who are older, when they didn't exist, and then they existed incrementally. So I bring that up because it seems to me that it's a context that we don't have today, that they didn't always exist, that yes, they did save time, but they also brought with them a lot of problems. And when the plan was broached to run in 59 to run 4 lanes through Franconia Notch, 2 of the people who objected to it were my grandfather and Sherman Adams, who had developed Loon. So, again, nuance and being on 2 sides of an issue and trying to understand it is really important. So hope that makes sense.
Brian, do you want to speak about your involvement with Franconia Notch?
Sure. Well, as I said earlier, I was basically a significantly younger man at the time when I got out of the Army and went to work for the Highway Department, New Hampshire Highway Department, and started off looking for sand and gravel and doing the things that geologists do for highway organizations. And the Interstate 93 had been basically pointed at Franconia Notch from the north all the way down to Littleton. Basically, at that time, the interstate hadn't been built into Franconia yet, and it had been built up to Lincoln at that point. And it was pretty clear it was going to go through Franconia Notch one way or the other. And I got involved with, because I was a geologist, in fact, the only one at the department in those days, I got involved with Paul Barfinger, who was a former boss of Jane's, and a variety of other folks in the White Mountains known as the White Mountain Environment Committee. And they were working with the Highway Department to try to determine if I-93 should go through Franconia Notch as a 4-lane highway or as a tunnel or as a 2-lane parkway. That was one of the alternatives. And I'm taking 16 alternatives and boiling them down to 4 here just so we don't take the whole day here. But in my youth and in my capacity as the only geologist in the department, I got summoned and ordered to work with the consultants that had been retained by the DOT, or Highway Department in those days, to conduct this environmental impact statement. And the piece of it that I was specifically supposed to look at was whether or not the old man of the mountain could survive construction of an interstate highway through the Notch. And that precipitated 2 summers of great summers for me personally, because I was a rock climber and all that kind of thing. And I got paid 2 summers in a row to rock climb on Cannon Cliff every day. But what we did in the meantime was to determine if the old man, if the rock structure of the old man could survive construction down below. And that information that we generated went into the evaluation, the environmental impact statement's evaluation of whether any kind of construction could go on in the Notch. I think Jane may have comments to make about the Forest Society's activity and all of that. But anyway, we determined that as long as certain vibrational restrictions were met, that you could probably build something underneath the old man without knocking it down, and that but that those specifications had to be adhered to pretty closely and carefully. The environmental impact statement, as I said, was looking at these 4 general alternatives, and I got involved in looking at the cut and cover tunnel and the driven tunnel, and some of the other more grand operational studies that were undertaken. Fortunately, from my point of view, they all got rejected, mainly for the extreme costs of all of it and the very, very hard rock they would have to go through. We made a lot of comparisons to tunneling that went on in Switzerland and in the Alps, where that was really at that point before the Eisenhower Tunnel was constructed in Colorado on I-70. those tunnels in Switzerland were really the longest driven tunnels in the world. And had the tunnel ever gone underneath the Franconia Notch, it would have been right there on that list as one of the longest ones. However, the vibrations that would have been created by that subterranean tunnel construction exceeded those limits that we had put onto the mechanism holding the old man up there. And so we were, I think, at least part of the process of getting the two-lane parkway selected as the alternative to go through the notch. So I guess that's probably a good, I know there'll be questions later, I'll be glad to answer them, but that kind of is where I got involved with Franconia Notch.
Awesome. Do you want to say as well?
Yeah, so how many of you have been through Franconia Notch? Yay.
Okay.
So that you know, when we're talking about Franconia Notch, we're talking about, or for some of us, we're talking about the old man of the mountain, we're talking about the flume, we're talking about the basin, we're talking about Profile Lake, we're talking about Artist Bluff, we're talking about Echo Lake. This is an incredible, both geological, scenic, natural, wonderful, incredible, place. The Rockies don't have it all. We've got some of it here in New Hampshire. And the Forest Society, which was founded in 1901, its original mission, which it still holds today, is to preserve the forests of New Hampshire by their wise use and their complete reservation in places of special scenic beauty. Today, we might say, sustainable forestry and wilderness. And the Forest Society has been involved in both of those parts of the same coin for over almost 125 years. So the little bit of history I want to do, first of all, Becky forgot to mention that her great-grandfather, John Weeks.
I knew you would.
Oh, is that okay? Or-
Yeah. No, I was counting on you.
Okay. John Weeks was the Secretary of Commerce?
At the time, no, at the time he was just a
That's a
representative,
Representative.
From
U.S.
Massachusetts.
Representative from Massachusetts.
but born in Lancaster.
But born in Lancaster, New Hampshire, is ours. Even though he lived in Massachusetts, people make mistakes. But he is responsible for the Weeks Act, which created all of the eastern national forests, including the White Mountain National Forest. So there's that bit of history. And then in the 20s,
In conjunction with the Forest Society and a lot of other organizations.
right, the Appalachian Mountain Club, the Forest Society were all part of that effort.
Right.
And in the 1920s, there were all kinds of hotels where people would come up and spend the summer. And one of those hotels burned down. The owners of that hotel, she knows history. I'm just telling stories. For me, sometimes, the value of the story is better than the actual facts. But
Well, you've got Becky and Marcia here.
they can help me, correct me. But so the hotels decided not to rebuild the hotel, and the land that they had owned, 6,000 acres, was sold to a lumber company that was going to just decimate all of Franconia Notch. And the Forest Society didn't want that to happen. So they did a massive campaign. The state of New Hampshire the price was $400,000, which was gazillions of dollars in those days. The state put up $200,000. A very wealthy man connected with the Forest Society put up $100,000. And the Forest Society raised $100,000 in a very short period of time, getting $1 per tree. That's how they raised money. School children would give their nickels. And so they raised the $400,000, and that allowed the state of New Hampshire to buy Franconia Notch to be the park that it is today. So the effort to protect Franconia Notch started long before the conversation about the highway started. And so in the 50s, the Forest Society and the Appalachian Mountain Club and many others did not want a 4-lane highway to go through the Notch. Because of all of the resources that are there, it was such an attraction for tourists that a 4-lane high-speed highway was not going to add to the value of the park. So with many others, they objected, and they Brian and Becky can probably tell you more about the details of the negotiations. But part of those negotiations in the end, and the 2-lane highway parkway it's the only one in the United States, the only parkway in the whole US transportation system on the interstates. Part of that agreement, though, was that if any changes were made to the building of the road, then both the Forest Society and the Appalachian Mountain Club had to be consulted. And indeed, about 15 years ago, I can't remember the date, when the parkway was originally constructed, there were these stone, what do you call it? Like a curb on each side of the road. And it was to guarantee that the road was never wider than the designated width in the original agreement. And it turned out that those curbs were interfering with snow plowing. And so they wanted to take up the curbs and do some other drainage things. You know, it's an old road. They needed to do some things to the road. So we and the Appalachian Mountain Club consulted with the Department of Transportation. And indeed, they removed the curbs. They did not widen the road. They wanted to put, are you ready? Jersey barriers down the middle of the parkway. And we said, no, we're not going to do that. And so one of the men, John Clement, who had been involved in the parkway, helped us, and we found these brown, the existing brown sort of little fences that go up the thing. And in order to do that, though, they're only graded for 45 miles an hour. So that's why the speed limit in the notch is 45 miles an hour, because that's the strength of that barrier, but it's better than a Jersey barrier. Yes. I'm sorry, did I make a mistake?
No, it just reminded me, interstate highways are kind of like a little thing that I'm very interested in, and that 45 miles an hour speed limit is actually one of the lowest max speed limits on any interstate in the country.
Yeah.
As a direct result of that, and I mean, when I drive it, at least going that slow lets me take in the scenery.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
Exactly.
I don't even, it's. I'm good.
So I had a problem with it because I'd be driving through the notch and I'd get up to like 55 miles an hour and I could just see the headline, President of the Forest Society in Franconia Notch, you know, it changed my life. But
Declan is.
I'm sorry, I just.
Say, do you guys, this is kind of a strange question, but you guys have like a certain level of, as much as I-93 was slightly disruptive to the notch and all this, do you guys have a certain level of pride in being responsible for like a relatively safe and productive construction that got, you know, the highway built and got the parkway built, but did it in a way that you maintained some integrity and some strength in that build? Are you proud of that? Or are you
Damn straight. I mean, so, you know, they talk about having saved Franconia Notch. The Forest Society likes to say that we saved Franconia Notch twice, and maybe twice and a half, you know.
See that Brian has something.
Did you have something you wanted to add, Brian?
Well, I was just, my thumbs up to what Jane said. I mean, it's an incredible achievement, and there's so many people involved in it over the years. The Franconia Notch itself, once you get there and spend some time, rather than just driving through it at 45 or 70, which is maybe more the common speed limit there today, even though it's not on the signs. You know, when you've had a chance to spend some time in Franconia Notch, it grows on you quickly. One thing Jane didn't point out was in 1945, in recognition of the really special situation that Franconia Notch represents environmentally, the National Park Service designated it as one of only 2 national natural landmarks in New Hampshire. So it's on the Federal Register, and the National Park Service has some very lightweight jurisdiction over what goes on there, particularly up around the Old Man of the Mountain. But the other natural landmark in New Hampshire is the Madison Boulder over near Conway. So it's a very special place, and it's been dedicated twice now to New Hampshire's war veterans, and it's a very important landmark in New Hampshire. and very, very, very much worth saving. I think Jane and all the other people that have been involved in it would agree with me.
How many people in here have actually seen in real life the old man of the mountain?
The old ones.
The old one.
So you have to understand that part of what we're talking about is real love for this incredible natural thing that looked like an old man, like an Indian chief or an old town meeting guy.
George Washington when they first found it.
Yeah, I mean, he was looking over this beautiful scenery, sort of watching over it, and you felt like watching over you. And it was a symbol of New Hampshire, and it was everywhere. It still is, but you know, you could see this guy that you loved, I think.
Particularly with the moonlight behind him. That was the best.
So in that vein, for the people who did see it in person, what was your general reactions, and especially to our panelists, because you guys worked so much in that area, what was your reaction when the old man in the mountain fell down?
I think Brian probably is the person who's.
Well, I had a very, if you pardon the expression, personal relationship with the old man because I'd done all the work on the rock mechanics. And I had never, including now with 70 years or 60 years of engineering geology in my background, I have seen and never saw before nor since a natural geologic structure that was that delicate and that remarkable anywhere. Right. The old man was it called to mind sort of an ethereal experience when you looked at how delicate that thing was, and the fact that it lasted as long as it did. I had when the old man fell, I was in my office down in Laconia, and I got a call from the Manchester Union leader telling me that the old man had collapsed last night, and my first reaction was, "Yeah, right. Go call somebody that cares about your joke." And shortly thereafter, I got a call from the governor's office, and what I thought was a joke wasn't a joke. And I hopped in the car along with and met some other people on the way up, including a fellow named Dick Hamilton, who I think we'll wind up talking about sooner or later here. He and I went up there, met with the folks up there, and I got a chance to get in the helicopter and ride up and see what was left of him. And I was in that kind of public setting, sort of controlling myself because we were answering questions and doing all sorts of stuff. But on the way home, had to pull over and shed a bunch of tears. It was a relationship that I valued very much. I still value it. And my expression of it today is through my involvement with the Old Man Legacy Fund.
Did you guys want to add in on that as well, or?
No, I think Brian has
Captured it.
expressed how all of us felt, but he knew it so intimately that that's a special situation. So thank you, Brian.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I also have to say, if anybody has a chance, so I don't know if you ever recorded it, but the talk you first gave on why the old man fell, was just really brilliant. And I think was a great example of how science can help you develop another perspective. So we all had our stories, we all had our connections to it, but when Brian explained the geology of what had actually happened, then it began to make sense. And it was actually quite comforting.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
Well, I haven't forgotten it.
I still get choked up at times when I talk about it. So it's never really going to leave me in that sense.
So I have a follow-up to that, Brian. How surprised were you? Was it a shocking but not surprising situation? Like, I knew this could happen, but it's shocking that it did? Or were you really quite surprised?
Yeah, no, I after we got done with the studies we had done in the mid 1970s, I would go around and give talks about it. And I would tell people, if you haven't seen it, you should go and see it. Because I could not confidently say that the stability of the old man was anything other than very delicate. In engineering and rock mechanics, we talk about something called the factor of safety. And what that, we try to get a factor of safety of 2, meaning that all the loads and the forces that would make something collapse are resisted by twice that effective force. So in other words, there's a factor of 2, meaning to say that the old man wouldn't collapse. And we never got that. You know, if the driving forces and the resisting forces are equal, you divide them and you get 1. And we never got past about 0.85 in the calculations that we did during that summer. So we knew the old man was very, very delicate, and living on borrowed time, we now know. But at the time, we didn't know how much. I was actually astonished at how long it took him to fall down after we did the studies. As Jane has heard me say before, every day I went up during the construction of I-93 to supervise the blasting designs. I had my bag packed so I could leave for Montreal if it fell down while I was on the job.
One of the things we didn't mention is that for years, there were people who climbed up the rock face and tried to stabilize it. There are turnbuckles, these big iron turnbuckles that fell down with the old man that were placed up there to try to hold it onto the cliff for years.
But the irony of that was that they were clamped to his forehead.
Right.
And when Brian finished doing his analysis, you know, it was like being an old person and having a double chin. That's where the problem was.
Just to put some scale to it, the rock mass of the old man weighed 7,200 tons. And that 7,200 tons was wedged between the upper portion of the old man's rock mass, the nose and eyebrow and forehead. And then the chin and the upper lip blocks were already separated from the cliff by natural weathering. And those two, the chin and upper lip, were wedged in position between the load above it and a very small bench, about half the size of that table you folks are sitting at right there in the room. And when that little bench, as I say, finally succumbed to the forces of nature, the granite weathering and the freezing and thawing and everything else that goes on up there, that crumbled, and then the old man simply toppled forward. And as Jane pointed out, the turnbuckles that were on the forehead came down with it.
So Brian, was it true that one of the things I remember was you made a point of saying that the notch is open to the southwest? And
Right.
so the prevailing winds, it was actually even more vulnerable because of the pathway of the notch itself. Is that correct? Am I
Right.
remembering that correctly?
No, you're right. One of the forces that really created the old man, but then also brought him down, was this freezing and thawing of water in the cracks and crevices. And the southwest wind in the warm, humid summers would drive air up to the north, towards the north, through the notch, and the cold rock would encounter the clouds, and the water would condense on the rock, and then the force of the wind would drive that moisture into the cracks and crevices. So after the old man collapsed, and we were able to get photographs of the rock mass inside the old man, we began to realize that he was actually rotting from the inside out from this weathering process that was pretty effective all around.
So amazing.
Just out of curiosity, who were the people that funded like putting the bolts in and putting in the chains? Like, who started that?
Well, the original there's several stages to this. The first of it was in 1910, 1912, along in there, when Reverend Guy Roberts, minister from I think Whitefield, who knew the owners of the Profile House, which is the hotel that Jane referred to earlier that burned down, and they subsequently didn't rebuild. that was roughly where the parking lot is for the Cannon Mountain Tramway today. They hired a quarryman from Quincy, Massachusetts, Edward Geddes, who came up and looked over the top of the old man and decided that a lot of the boulders on top of the forehead needed to be stabilized, because he recognized how carefully or how delicately balanced it was up there, and he thought if those boulders rolled off, it could upset the balance and collapse the old man. So the next summer he came back and, working with a 3-pound sledgehammer and a star drill, installed a series of retaining rods to hold those boulders on top of the forehead in place. And some of those tie rods survived the collapse of the old man. So they're still up there with the residual rock mass that's up there. Anyway, subsequent to that, along about, I think it was in 1958, and the joke is that this was in preparation for the visit of then President Eisenhower. It was decided that the old man's forehead needed attention for 2 reasons. First of all, they didn't want it to collapse before he got here or during his visit. And also the front portion of the forehead slab had moved towards the valley from the back portion, and there was actually light shining through his forehead. And of course, we couldn't have the old man with a hole in his head for the presidential visit. So a concrete plug was installed, which if you see photos looking down on the old man's profile about that time or a little later, you can see this concrete plug in there. But at that time, that's when it was decided to install the turnbuckles. And they're 4-inch turnbuckles, pretty substantial pieces of steel. And that work was paid for partially by by what was then the Bureau of Public Roads, which is a predecessor of today's Department of Transportation, and the state of New Hampshire. And those lasted until the old man collapsed. And they were simply ripped out of position when the whole rock mass collapsed. But anyway, that's the story of the reinforcement that was put in there. There was really no way to get underneath the old man with equipment, and it was a pretty dangerous place. And we got underneath there to do the studies with all sorts of, at the time, fancy rock climbing techniques, which today are, people yawn when they hear about them today. It's advanced. That's a science of itself that's advancing very quickly. But there was literally in those days no way to get underneath the old man to do anything to where the action was.
We just have one more question for you guys, and then we'll open it up for the crowd. Our question is, what is your role moving forward to take care of rural spaces? And what encouragement would you give to future generations to do the same?
You're looking at me?
I don't know. Do you?
Either of you guys can start.
For me, it's conservation easements and developing contiguous habitats. So making sure that there are corridors for animals. Amy here, Bellamagna, her course on fragmentation is just a wonderful way of helping anybody, including elderly people, understand why conservation easements, and I think there's a misunderstanding about conservation easements. They don't preclude you treating it as an asset and selling it if that has to happen and all the rest of it. It's just that you have made sure that land that is in areas that are sensitive is being set aside for future generations. So that's, for me, a major interest, has been for a long time, and will continue to be as long as my brain's going.
So I would agree with Becky. As a forester, I think it's important that forests and land both be used and also be protected. And I think there are, I worked for a land conservation organization that was both a forestry organization that managed land and protected land using conservation easements. Do you all know what conservation easements are?
Well, do you know how they work? Because they're really fascinating.
An explanation.
Good, go for it.
So if you're a private landowner, and let's just say you own 100 acres of land and it's very special for whatever reasons, maybe it has special water features, or the soil is really productive, that it grows really great trees, or is fabulous wildlife habitat, or has rare and endangered species on it. And you want to make sure that that land is never developed, it's never paved, it's never turned into a Walmart. You can work with a qualified conservation organization like the Forest Society or other land trust, and you can actually donate or sell the development rights to that organization. And then the development rights are essentially and legally extinguished. And the organization takes on the role and the responsibility of making sure that whatever the agreements are in the conservation easement are kept forever, whether you own the land, who put the conservation easement on it, or you've sold it to somebody else, or your heirs inherit it. So it always stays as protected land. And so there are lots of roles for young people to get involved in conservation, not just in ways of being out on the land and looking at it and analyzing what's there. There's a real need for lawyers who are interested in crafting conservation easements. There are roles for people who raise money to have conservation, to make conservation possible when conservation easements or land is bought. There are roles for people who know about natural resources to be parts of these land organizations, to go out and steward the lands and make sure that the conservation easements are being upheld. There are roles for foresters to be involved. So there's like lots and lots of different ways to be involved in conservation. So I retired 5 years ago. I'm now involved with my local land trust. You know, you sort of, once it gets in your blood, you kind of can't let go of it. Excuse me. And so I think that there are lots of opportunities that you may not be thinking about yet. But, we need people who understand business, you know, to be involved in conservation easements. The history of land use is important in conservation easements and in conservation. So there are lots of, we need storytellers, you know, English majors who can help other people understand why conserving land is so important. So I think there are lots of opportunities for all of you, if you're interested in conservation, to be involved.
Brian?
Oh,
Yeah,
geologists too, geologists. Sorry,
okay.
Brian.
I've sort of morphed the geology hat into the Old Man Legacy Fund. The Old Man Legacy Fund, in this context of the session today, is I think of some interest in its preservation activity. The old man collapsed, and as you heard, it was a very bad day for an awful lot of people. And we at the time, and this is now 20 plus years ago, never really understood the relationship between the people in New Hampshire and elsewhere. On that day and the days following, we had response to the old man's collapse from all over the world. Anybody that ever saw it had an impact. And I don't think at the time, my predecessor as president of the Old Man Legacy Fund, Dick Hamilton, told me he never realized how the old man's profile and people seeing it impacted them, and how they carried that away as a real moniker of what they had during their experience visiting New Hampshire. And that created, of course, an enormous economy around the old man. The old man is the draw, you know, that would get people to come up, spend the night, eat the restaurants, and so on and so forth. But we also began to realize that there was an emotional connection between people who had seen the old man and the old man, and that is the connection that really has created this legacy that we're trying to preserve. To give you just a simple example of it, I don't know how many of you folks in the room were alive when Princess Diana was killed in a car accident, but those of us that are older will remember it. For literally a week after that, every morning in front of Buckingham Palace were piles and piles of votive candles and flowers and other expressions of mourning and grief from the people who who were devastated by her accidental death. The same thing happened at the Old Man of the Mountain down by Profile Lake. The park staff was down there for about a week or maybe even 10 days, cleaning up flowers and votive candles and all sorts of expressions of grief, the kinds of things you would expect to see in a cemetery with, a beloved relative had passed away or perhaps a parent. And so we embarked in trying to figure out what this legacy ought to be. And for those of you who haven't been up to the monument, the memorial rather, that's there, I would encourage you to go, because we think we've created something that up there that recreates and the experience of not being able to see the old man until you get yourself in just the right position to see it. I think the older folks in the room will probably remember as a kid, you drive up there and you're up on Route 3 in those days and driving along at 50 or whatever miles an hour and we're going to see the old man. In the meantime, you're in the back seat fighting with your brother or sister, and in that 30-second at 35 or 40 miles an hour, in that 30-second window, you'd miss it. You had to be just in the right place to see it, and that activity made it mysterious in a sort of way. But with a mystery that's continued in everyone's recognition of the old man. But in the process of doing that memorial, we had to face some of the issues Jane was referring to. There was the section of people that wanted to create a more elaborate, use the old man as a more elaborate basis for a sort of as we've affectionately referred to it, as a Disneyland approach. A tourist attraction that would get people to come up and see where the old man was and all of that, and the various gift shops and trinket tree sales and so on and so forth that would develop around it was very attractive from an economic point of view. And in that first 5 years or so, we were battling the economic interests, economic development potential of the old man having collapsed versus the essentially non-economic benefits of having a memorial there that would send the message of what the old man really meant to everybody. And I think as Jane's pointing out with preserving rural spaces, those are the kinds of subtle but really important controversies that go on. It isn't always a big development potential. It often can be, but often it isn't. And these little postage stamps of conservation easements. I say they're postage stamps. Some of them are not really postage stamps. Some of them are quite substantial, but they put together a quilt, a conservation quilt that is going to really be important to saving these rural spaces going forward into the future. And I think those considerations are really important. And I'm not sure there's a textbook anyplace that really describes the process, because it depends on the piece of land, it depends on the people involved, and what the land means to them, or in my case with the old man, what it meant to them. That's a long answer to the question. I apologize.
I do want to ask you, we do have some questions that are going to come in on the chat, but I want to ask you about the controversies around developing these rural spaces and moving people from below the notch to above it. We make a great case for preserving the notch the way it is, right? What is the other side of the coin? Why did people want to drive a highway, a huge interstate route? Why do people want to come up and develop our beautiful areas? Can you talk about sort of that flip side of the coin?
Yeah, I think we've faced that a little bit with the Old Man Memorial Project. I think people have a fundamental desire to come into contact with something that the rural spaces represent. The built up constructed world is so controlled and so formulated that you have to integrate your personality into the constructed environment and become part of it in order to function within it. And I think up here in the rural spaces, particularly Franconia Notch, people come up, they can relax all of that. Franconia Notch doesn't demand that you be dressed a certain way, or that you act a certain way, or that you come on a certain schedule and do that kind of thing. I came to that understanding through the controversy that went on between whether this should be a tourist attraction, the Old Man's Memorial, or whether it should be something more personal, something where you or I could go based on our experience with the old man, or if you never saw the old man, you could go in and have your own experience interactively, coming in contact with what the old man meant. And I think that's a crucial, and I'm not sure I'm articulating the insight accurately the way many other people who have, well, like Jane's, she calls herself a recovering English major, but Jane has some really good ways of expressing this that I think are important. But it's a very personal thing, and groups of people like the AMC and the Forest Society find themselves identifying with one another about it. And I think the articulation of that is a really important thing for the young folks in the room to think about doing. If that could be articulated in a way that was generalized enough so that most people could identify with it, I think it would be very effective. And Jane, I didn't mean to set you up as a segue here, but.
It's okay, Brian. So, I think one of the reasons that people wanted to develop the Notch is if you talk to any trucker who's responsible for getting goods from Boston or Concord or Manchester to the North Country, above the notches, as we say.
Or Montreal.
Or Montreal, if they're going to Montreal, they'll tell you that the slowdown through the notch is a pain in the rear. That's an understandable thing. That's money to them, and it costs money. I think money is a huge driver. Of course, always follow the money. If you can make money by building a hotel or having a tchotchke shop at the base of where the old man was and make money, that's another reason why people aren't particularly interested in conservation. I often sort of, is anybody here from Conway, New Hampshire? Okay, okay, sorry. There are two ways to approach, there are more than two ways, but two ways to approach the White Mountains is through Franconia Notch, this beautiful, natural, incredible notch that with no commercial enterprise to take you into the White Mountains, or you can go through Conway. And Conway is a lovely town, and it has some beautiful outdoor spaces, but it's a very different approach to the White Mountains than is Franconia Notch. And I think in New Hampshire, we have both. And, so we don't need to make Franconia Notch into another North Conway or Conway, but we need to recognize the value of each of those for very different reasons and for different people. Did I do that okay? So I think there are people who are not happy with the notch necessarily, but I think, New Hampshire people have traditionally and continue to stand up for natural places. That it's part of the reason we live here. It's not just something that's up there. It surrounds us in our local communities. And over and over again, when there have been crises about development versus major developments versus nature versus conservation, conservation has often won. I would use the example of Northern Pass as being another one, where the money interests wanted to build a huge electrical facility from Canada down to Boston, down to Londonderry, New Hampshire, but the people of New Hampshire were having none of it. And they made that very clear.
Have you all, Amanda or Declan, have you all discussed Northern Pass at all?
No, we haven't.
Okay. Well, that is a great example, maybe something for the class to consider, or any of you individually. Look up Northern Pass Transmission LLC, and it was a remarkable experience that the Forest Society and a lot of individuals were involved with. So, but I'd be interested to hear the questions from the.
Yeah.
Yeah, we want to open up to people in the crowd and the people on Zoom of any questions they might have for.
There is a question in the chat.
Okay.
If anyone knows the story of the mysterious missing exit on I-93.
Is that exit 21?
Exit 21?
21, I believe.
21? Anyone know that story?
Marianne does.
I'm not sure, but I heard that there was, but the exit is, it's down, it's below us, right? Okay. There was gonna be an exit, I think, in Franklin. And then there wasn't. But they couldn't, all the numbers were set. So rather than redo all the numbers, they just left out 21.
Right.
Interesting.
Besides the old man, what's your favorite part about the Notch?
Good question.
I love the Pemigewasset River. I'm a river person, so any opportunity to get out and walk along the river and just sit and listen to it. It's a remarkable, and it's part of why there is a notch.
Right.
So although Brian can probably address that more successfully than me. But anyway, I'm interested, how many of you live in urban areas versus, or grew up in versus rural areas? Rural or urban? So,
Hands up for urban.
oh, so that's a good mix. 80% of the United States, Becky may correct me or Marcia, I think 80% of the United States today, it lives in what are considered urban areas.
Actually don't know.
And 20% rural. So the fact that this class is actually fairly evenly divided is an interesting fact in itself. When the Weeks Act was passed, or the Forest Society was founded, when we talk about conservation, it was the almost exact reverse. 80% of the country was involved in agriculture of some sort, 20% lived in cities. So that's a really significant change. I mean, I'm a medievalist, actually. So I tend to see things in thousands of years. And, these are changes which come and go, but that's a major, in this country, that's a huge flip. So anyway, I'm interested to hear experiences from your class.
I want to hear Jane and Brian's favorite non-old man part of the notch.
I'm not sure what my favorite part is. I really like Artist Bluff when there aren't too many people up there. The view up there is great. And I also love walking down to Profile Lake because it's just such a nice place to walk down. I mean, it's the park. It's, I don't know that there's one particular place that is my favorite. And I like driving through the Notch also. I guess I'm a tourist if I'm not at home, but I just think it's a beautiful place.
And Brian as well, what was your favorite part besides the old man?
Oh, well, I think the sort of the north central part of the Notch is my favorite. Profile Lake. There is a trail network around Profile Lake, which connects partly with the bike path. That is a very mellow, it's too bad there's an interstate highway right across the pond from you. But on the other hand, the trail is quite peaceful, and except for the truck noise, and the views of Eagle Cliff and Mount Lafayette on that side are extraordinary. Some of the famous artists who Thomas Cole and some of those folks did paintings along the Pemigewasset Trail that very, very few people get there. And so it's extraordinary in Franconia Notch because the trail isn't completely worn down to roots and rocks.
Are any of you fisher people? Yeah, it's still great fishing. I love watching the anglers, watching them cast.
It looks like we have a question on Zoom. Someone asked, what is the definition of urban these days?
Becky, what do you think?
I'm sure there's a very specific Census Bureau definition of, population density.
Yeah,
I don't know what it is now. I know it was like 1820, but I don't think that's what it is.
Amanda?
Like 3,000 residents per square mile or something. It changes, right?
Well, right.
It's interpreted in different ways every year.
Like, I think definition of here, whether,
Definition of rural changes.
Right.
right, I think asking people here whether they are urban or rural is probably hard because
Yes.
people might say, well, it feels rural to me, but actually the Census Bureau would say, nah, that's a.
Urban, right. Yes, and I'm giving the kind of the official definition,
Yeah.
which is the 80-20 split.
Do you think that varying definition is what causes such a huge change in that percentage split? That went from the 80% rural to 20% urban to then 80% urban to 20%.
For myself, I think it's I think it's economic, if there's economic opportunity, which is actually at the essence of what Amanda was saying. I can tell you as a medievalist, that's what changes the landscape.
The settlement did change, not just the definition.
Yeah, right. So if there's an opportunity for people to support themselves in a different, better way, they're going to take advantage of it.
This person wanted to know, when did the state/federal government discard the plans to widen I-93 instead of doing the parkway?
Let's see, I believe, Jane, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the final White Mountain Environment Committee settlement with everybody was in either 1980 or 81, wasn't it?
No, earlier than that.
It was, okay.
It would have been the early 70s.
Right.
No, I think
Or
it's
late
late
60s.
70s. The
Late
final
70s?
decision, because the cut and cover stuff, I mean, that was gonna be pretty big, like, because I think that's, or Chris, are you asking about the like 6-lane fill in everything, fill in echo and profile version, or some of the?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Chris.
Right. So, yeah, there was a plan in 1959,
Yes.
right? And then I always understood, and I could have this wrong, but I always understood the original idea was that they were going to make it as wide as the rest of the highway, all the way through the notch.
Yep.
And then at some point they discarded that. And I know that that's been discussed during the panel. I've been listening, but I haven't absorbed exactly when they realized, well, we're not going to blast into the cliffs on either side, and we're not going to, which is really kind of that's an amazingly wonderful decision that they didn't widen it more.
The environmental impact statement, I believe, was finally completed in 1977. The actual paperwork for it,
Right.
And that I mean, that didn't settle that was just the environmental impact statement. I think then it went, and Jane, I don't know if you remember, I think it went forward from there into the White Mountain Environment Committee and the cooperation between them and the DOT and the Federal Highway Administration. And I just, Christine, I just can't remember. I know it's along in that time frame, but I can't tell you but by the way, Christine, I didn't realize you were on the call. Good to see you again.
Hi, yeah. Nice to see you.
Yeah, no, I think it was 70s is what I remember. And, but it was amazing how long it took to finalize.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the part that you look back and think, oh my goodness.
I mean, the actual construction of the sections through the notch from roughly North Lincoln up through where it had been finished up through Franconia, that was all in the mid 1980s.
Mhm.
The section right under the old man was 1985 and 86. So,
Right. Yeah, I know my favorite view is the view when you come around after, right about where, Megan, where you are. Come around that corner after, what's the name of the?
Tripoli? Right by
Yes,
Tripoli?
Tripoli Road.
Yeah.
That's It's just, you know, and that didn't exist. I never saw that view.
Right, you're up so high there. You get this like bird's eye view into the notch.
Yeah.
That's an amazing view.
Just to follow up on Christine's, Brian, earlier you mentioned that there were like 16 different competing plans and you were kind of trimming things down. I'm wondering what would have been the most devastating plan? Is it 6 lanes, fill in both lakes, drill into the cliffs, create enough reverberations to knock off the old man in the 70s? Or is there, or are there even more knockoff effects that were sort of like avoided by going with the Parkway?
Well, I think I think as far as the old man in the rock mechanics of the old man, either one of the tunnel options probably would have been fatal to the old man. Obviously, the tunnel versions would have taken it sort of be like the Eisenhower Tunnel is today in Colorado. In other words, old Route 3, U.S. Route 3, would have been probably upgraded some, but it would have been a 2-lane road, winding around the way it always did with its steep grades and so on. All the truck traffic would go off and go through the tunnel instead. But either one of those tunnel options would have taken the old man down, so they were taken off the table at that point because of that. I think I'm not sure, Jane, maybe you can remember, but I don't think there was ever an alternative that had more than 4 lanes on it for the park. I think there were turning lanes and access lanes to like Lafayette Campground and things like that, but there was never any, 6 lanes going through the notch or anything like that I can remember.
No, the 59 proposal was 4 lanes.
Yeah.
And that was the one that they paid for an engineering study. So my sense was they were going to stick with it.
Yeah, I think that would have radically changed the floor of the notch. I mean, the floor of the notch isn't that much space anyway. It's a long ribbon, if you will. And the 4-lane, when you take the side slopes and the exit ramps and all the rest of it, would have pretty much filled up the bottom of Franconia Notch.
So hi, everyone on Zoom. Thank you for joining us. And if you were here a little late for some context, my name is Amanda Whitworth, and I am a professor facilitating a capstone experience for students of all disciplines in our general education component called Home. And our theme is rural storytelling. And in this class, we do 2 things. So first, we work on developing and stewarding the habits of mind. These are 4 habits that help you show up as a critical thinker, a good human, a person who puts out action into the world that can have impact. And the second thing we do is use design thinking to develop projects that can take bites out of interesting and complex problems. So rural storytelling is our theme. And what we're doing first is sort of starting to understand a very broad story about what is going on. And we turn to a collaboration with Megan and Kayla at the museum to start thinking about rurality in our place, this place that we call home in New Hampshire, or our home away from home, because many of the students in the course are not from New Hampshire, or about half of them have grown up in urban areas, as you asked. So we're trying to sort of wrap our minds around what are the stories and what tendrils do those stories have in different sectors. And so my design challenge to the class was to help create an opportunity for both themselves and others to hear stories about this rural place. Where we go next is to take seeds from this discussion, plus other points and interests that students have brought to the class, to develop small teams of students who will identify some challenges and areas where they might have impact. And then they design and deploy projects that can actually support that. So I can imagine, based on the interests of students I have in class, we may have students who are interested in the ways that we, as Ryan suggested, tell the story of belonging in New Hampshire, and we share that with external partners who might be able to use it to promote conservation or stewardship of our lands. I could imagine a group of students who are focused on business to look at some of the maybe, well, the good, bad, and ugly of rural revitalization and develop some project around stewarding some work with a local business that's maybe in a very rural area or creating something there. So the course design is emergent. I am more of a facilitator than an expert in the room. I'm guided by the interest of students, and they have started to write a primer on what they see as prevailing rural stories and where we might support that. And their next step is to think about those ideas through the lens of their discipline or their major. And then we'll end up doing a lot of sticky business of putting ourselves in groups and thinking about how we might make some kind of impact, leave the world a little bit better, do no harm, do some good research. Some of it might work, some of it might not. But ultimately, it's about showing up with good research, making connections to people in the world who can help you build your knowledge base, help you ask better questions, and then ultimately put something into the world that you are proud of, that you've worked on collaboratively. So where we go is, it's coming. It's coming, but this is a really cool class. Many of them do, like Zena, she's from Lincoln. We have a lot of New Hampshire folks here, but we have other people who are really new and have never been up through the notch. So it brings those stories together.
I want to take this opportunity to answer your question as well, because I, for the museum, have a slightly different response. For us, today's event was a way to connect with a class that happens to meet in our building. So wanting to think about this not only as a space with a classroom, but as a cultural heritage institution on our campus. So connecting with students in a new way for us, at least in my 3 years at the museum. And then also this event is a kind of kickoff for a larger project that we're going to be working on. Because I think that these stories, this is a sort of new experience for me when Brian was like, oh, if it's only the old people in the room who saw the old man in the mountain. And I was like, oh no, what happened? I didn't know. You know. Today's the day I am of the old people. So welcome. But as someone who I think is on the younger age of the old people, I'm still going to hang on to that for a while. I also recognize that there are amazing stories to be told about life before the interstate, the work that went into protecting the kind of wild beauty of Franconia Notch, and that this oral history project that we're kicking off is at least an attempt to collect some of those stories. So for those of you in the room who have stories to share or on Zoom, we'd love to find a time to sit down for you and I to talk and to record those stories. One, to archive them, to have them for you know, the young people of whom I am no longer. Yeah, so maybe. Yeah, so it may be that there's continued an additional connection with the class. But so there's one to sort of archive these stories, and the other more kind of immediate project is that this summer we are one of the 3 hosts in New Hampshire for a traveling exhibition called Crossroads: Change in Rural America, that the Smithsonian Museums on Main Street program has put together. So that exhibition will be here in the basement classroom where those of us in person are sitting. And then upstairs in the gallery, we're working with the historical societies in Plymouth, Lincoln and Woodstock, Franconia and Bethlehem to put together a companion exhibition that looks at these same questions about land, community, identity, managing change, and persistence. Those are the main themes of the Smithsonian exhibition. And for those communities, right, the Franconia Notch is this like outsized character in the lives of folks who live on either side of it, right? I ran into someone at the grocery store on, I guess it was Sunday, who couldn't believe that I had driven through the notch to get my groceries, right? Like, why would you choose to go through the notch just for groceries, especially if you could come to the market basket? No, I drive through the notch for my groceries. And so, it needs no qualifier, right? We talk about Franconia Notch State Park, but the notch, at least in the Western White Mountains, right? And, I grew up above the notches because it was, depending where you were going was which one you went through, but Franconia Notch is this sort of outsized character in the lives of those communities. So the kind of central, the apps area upstairs, that curved wall and the two walls flanking it are all going to be about Franconia Notch as this kind of bridge and barrier between these communities. So the material in my ideal world, which is where I tend to live, material that comes out of these conversations will be part of that exhibition, whether it's pull quotes that end up in text panels, or maybe we'll have some audio clips that folks can listen to. That's all still kind of in development, maybe with other faculty colleagues and classes, maybe with this class, maybe with a student who's helping me. Like the exact mechanics of it are yet to be determined, but I feel like these are really important stories to save. So that's my answer. And now Violet is gonna
Close us up. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're on.
Hello, I'm Violet again. So as we wrap up, we just wanted to say thank you to all of our panelists, Dr. Rebecca Weeks, Sherrill Moore. I did it from
Becky,
memory.
just say Becky.
See, that's what I would say
My
too.
students always just call me Becky. So much simpler.
Mr. Brian Fowler and Mrs. Jane Diffley, we would like to thank you all for coming out. We couldn't have had this panel without you and you coming. You've been very fun to
Oh.
watch.
She's listening.
We'd also like to extend our thanks to all of you for coming out. The panel wouldn't be very interesting if it was just us and 3 people. I mean, it would be interesting to me, but it's a bit more interesting with a whole audience. We hope you enjoyed learning more about the stories of Franconia Notch, I-93, and some of the people whose lives that area has touched. Finally, we'd like to extend our thanks to the museum and its staff, especially Megan and Kayla, for helping us create and host this exhibition. We wouldn't have been able to do this without them. But if that's all the questions everyone has, I'd like to thank you and wish you a great day.
One final thing. So one of the things I love about the mountains in general is perspective. And it doesn't matter where you are, it's always a new perspective. So if you haven't been to the North Country, where Megan and I are from, Franconia Notch looks quite different from the North. So I encourage you to go up, go to the rocks, go to Weeks State Park, which has got a 360-degree view of the whole region. Mount Washington does take a hike up Wombeck and Star King, and you'll get different perspectives from each location. And to me, that's one of the great things about the mountains, is that it reminds us that we are just a small bit in a much larger world.